James River breaks, South Dakota, October 1902. The prairie grass was the color of old brass, and the wind already carried the scent of iron from the north. On the high ground overlooking the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul right-of-way, Václav Dolezal was committing an act of profound and visible foolishness. With a team of borrowed oxen and a tangle of block and tackle, he was dragging a derelict railroad caboose up the slope to his claim. The car, stripped of its trucks and undercarriage, slid grudgingly over greased log skids, its faded red paint a scar against the muted landscape. Down on the tracks, the section crew paused their work, leaning on their tamping bars to watch the spectacle. Their foreman, Ferris Tolmachoff, a man whose authority was as straight and rigid as the rails he maintained, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the ballast. "Look at that crazy bohemian." One of the men, a young hand named Miller, chuckled. "Thinks he's gonna live in that? The winter'll pop the seams on that thing like a dry seed pod." "It's a fool's errand," Tolmachoff declared, his voice carrying easily on the thin air. He knew rail cars. He knew their strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses. "That car's off its trucks, Dolezal," he hollered up the hill, cupping his hands around his mouth. "The frost'll heave it 6 inches and rack the frame. You'll have gaps you can throw a cat through by January." Václav Dolezal, a compact man with quiet hands and a face accustomed to careful observation, merely paused, wiped his brow, and gave a short, non-committal wave. He said nothing. He simply turned back to his oxen, speaking to them in a low Czech dialect they understood better than the foreman's warnings. The caboose groaned, scraped, and moved another few feet up the hill. It was a mad, laborious, and to every practical man watching, utterly doomed enterprise. They all knew what a Dakota winter did to a proper frame house, let alone a cast-off box of iron and wood designed to roll, not rest. What did this bohemian railcar finisher, a man who had spent his life polishing the interiors of luxury carriages in a European factory, understand about thermal physics and solar gain, that a seasoned section foreman, a man who lived and breathed the brutal realities of a northern prairie, had missed? I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand not just how a simple caboose could defy a Dakota winter, but you'll learn the fundamental principles of passive solar design that engineers still use today. Stick with me, and if you find value in this story of ingenuity, consider subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Václav Dolezal was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, and he certainly was not a frontiersman in the way his neighbors understood the term. He was a finisher, a specialist from the famed Ringhofer works of Smichov, a district of Prague. His hands were not trained to fell trees or frame walls, but to work with the delicate tolerances of brass fittings, the precise application of shellac, the airtight sealing of window sashes on carriages destined for the Tsar of Russia or the Orient Express. He understood the behavior of wood and metal when subjected to the violent temperature swings between a sun-baked Balkan summer and a frozen Polish winter. He knew how a structure built for motion could be made impervious to the elements. This knowledge had been useless during his first winter in South Dakota. He, his wife Anichka, and their 2 small children, Jan and Susanna, had spent it in a hastily built soddy, the standard dwelling of the plains. That winter had been a relentless education in failure. It was a cold that was not a temperature, but a presence, an active, invasive force that found every flaw. He remembered the feeling of his wet boots, left by the stove, being frozen into the floorboards by morning. He remembered the bottle of ink on the small table turning to a solid, useless block of black ice, and the cheap tin whistle he'd bought for his son Jan, producing only a flat, dead puff of air, its metal so cold it stole the heat and life from his breath. Anichka had been brave, but he saw the fear in her eyes as she piled every blanket they owned onto the children, who slept in their coats and hats. The problem wasn't the stove. They burned wood constantly. The problem was the house itself. It was a sieve. It leaked heat from 1,000 invisible wounds. That winter, Václav didn't just feel the cold, he studied it. He watched where the frost formed on the inside of the walls, mapping the paths of thermal bridging. He felt the drafts not as a nuisance, but as a current, a river of precious warmth flowing out of their lives. He was a man trained to see imperfections, and his sadi was a masterpiece of them. The conventional wisdom of the prairie was to build thick and burn hot. Neighbors like the O'Malleys and the Svenssons had cabins of cottonwood logs, chinked with mud and grass. They were stout, honest structures, built from the land itself. But they were failing too, just more slowly than Václav's sadi. Their failure was measured in the immense stacks of cordwood that dwindled at an alarming rate. A standard claim shack, 16 by 20 feet, with single-pane glass and uninsulated walls, could leak over 50,000 BTUs of heat per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees. The stove, no matter how furiously it burned, was fighting a battle it could never win. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The heat was generated, but it was immediately lost to conduction through the walls and glass, and to convection as cold air infiltrated every crack around the doors and windows. The James River breaks, a series of rolling hills and ravines carved by the river, acted as natural wind tunnels, amplifying the assault on these fragile shelters. The result was a house of stark contrasts, a scorching circle 3 feet from the stove, and freezing temperatures in every corner. It was a life spent huddled, never truly warm, always breathing smoke, and always worried about the woodpile. Václav knew he could not outburn the Dakota winter. He had to outthink it. His mind went back to the rail yards. He had seen them there, in the boneyard behind the roundhouse, old cars, put out to pasture, boxcars, flatbeds, and a handful of cabooses, their service lives over. To the railroad, they were scrap. To Václav, they were something else. They were engineered structures, designed by clever men in distant cities to withstand constant vibration and extreme weather. A house is static. A rail car is dynamic. It must hold its integrity while being slammed, shaken, and exposed to 100-degree heat and 40 below cold, all in the same year. Its walls were a sandwich of thick wood and iron sheathing. Its windows were small and designed to be sealed tight. It was, in essence, a high-performance mobile building envelope. For $15, a sum that made Anichka's face tighten with worry, he purchased Caboose number 483 from a yard manager who thought he was selling it for firewood. The real cost was in the labor. For 2 weeks he worked to prepare the path, felling what few trees he could find to use as skids. The journey of 300 yards from the siding to his chosen spot on the claim took 4 grueling days. He placed it with the obsessive precision of his old trade, not square to the world, but square to the sun. He aligned its long axis perfectly east to west, so the raised cupola, the brakeman's lookout post with its array of windows, had its largest panes facing directly south. This was not for the view. It was for a purpose none of the onlookers could comprehend. Ferris Tolmachov came by during the final placement, standing with his hands on his hips, a picture of professional skepticism. "You put it on that pile of rocks, the first hard freeze will shift it on you, mark my words." Václav was carefully leveling a course of flat river stones for the caboose to rest on, creating a pier foundation that would allow the frozen ground to heave around it, rather than under it. "The ground moves," Václav said, his English careful and deliberate. "The stones will hold the car above the ground." "And that cupola," Tolmachov scoffed, pointing. That's for looking, not for living. It's got a dozen seams. It'll leak snow and rain like a basket. You'll have a column of ice in your living room. I will seal it, Václav replied, returning to his work. He didn't argue, he didn't defend. He simply worked, using oakum and hot pitch, materials he'd seen used to seal the decks of ships. He meticulously caulked every joint, every seam, every nail hole on the caboose. He treated the roof not as a carpenter would, but as a carriage maker would, making it a single, monolithic, waterproof surface. He reglazed every window in the cupola, setting the glass in a thick, resinous compound that would remain flexible in the cold. Inside, he did not install a huge, wood-hungry pot-belly stove. Instead, he built a small, compact stove of his own design, lining a cast-iron box with a full course of fire brick. It was small, but it was dense. The mockery from the section crew lasted through November. The validation would last for the rest of his life. To understand what Václav had built, you have to understand the sun, not the high, intense sun of summer, but the low, precious sun of winter. On the 43rd parallel north, where the Dolajal claim sat, the sun in December hangs low in the southern sky, its arc shallow and its light seeming to lack strength. But it is still a thermonuclear furnace, pouring energy onto the earth. The problem is capturing it. A south-facing window becomes a passive solar collector. The physics is elegant and undeniable. Sunlight is composed of various wavelengths. The short-wave radiation, visible light, passes easily through glass. When this radiation strikes a surface inside the caboose, the floor, a wall, a piece of furniture, it is absorbed and re-emitted as long-wave radiation, which we feel as heat. Glass, which is transparent to short-wave radiation, is largely opaque to the outgoing long-wave radiation. The heat is trapped. This is the greenhouse effect, the same principle that warms a car parked in the sun on a winter day. Václav's genius was in recognizing the caboose's cupola as a perfect, pre-built engine for this process. It wasn't just a window, it was a solar furnace. On a clear day, even at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the sun striking those south-facing panes of glass was delivering approximately 250 BTUs per hour for every square foot of glass. The cupola had roughly 40 square feet of glass facing south. That meant on a sunny day, it was passively capturing 10,000 BTUs per hour, the equivalent of a small electric heater running at full blast for free. This created a pocket of intensely warm air at the ceiling. But hot air rises, so how does that warm the living space below? This is where the confined geometry of the caboose became an advantage. The superheated air in the cupola had nowhere else to go. It created a pressure differential, driving a slow, steady convective loop. The warm air would spill down the northern wall of the interior, displacing the cooler, denser air on the floor, which would then be drawn up toward the heat source at the ceiling. Over the course of a day, this gentle, continuous circulation would warm the entire volume of the small structure. Furthermore, the materials themselves became part of the system. The dark wood floor and the dense mass of the fire brick stove absorbed the solar radiation all day, becoming a thermal battery. After the sun went down, they would slowly release that stored heat back into the space, smoothing out the temperature drop overnight. The fire brick stove, heated by just a small, slow-burning fire, would radiate heat for hours after the flames died down. Its purpose wasn't just to generate heat, but to hold it. Václav hadn't just built a shelter, he had built a system, a passive machine for living, fueled by the sun and a pittance of wood. The mockery was based on what the caboose looked like, a strange, iron-bound box. The reality was based on what it did. It harvested the sky. That winter announced its arrival with a unique and terrifying phenomenon, the Koto ice fog. For 11 straight days in January, a thick, supercooled fog settled over the prairie highlands. The temperature plunged to 24 degrees below zero and stayed there. It was not a blizzard. There was no snow and little wind. It was a still, silent, crystalline cold that coated every surface with a thick armor of rime ice. Tree branches, fence wires, and railroad tracks grew into fantastic, feathery sculptures of white. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a siege. The sun, a pale, useless disk, was blotted out. There was no solar gain, only catastrophic heat loss. The Svensson's well pump, its iron handle exposed to the air, froze solid. For 3 days they had to melt ice from the cattle trough for drinking water. At the O'Malley place, the constant drafts and damp cold settled in Mrs. O'Malley's chest, turning a cough into a rattling, dangerous illness. Their cabins were filled with smoke from fires pushed to their absolute limit, the green cottonwood popping and hissing, creating more smoke than heat. They were burning through their winter wood supply at a terrifying pace. Life shrank to the few feet around the stove. Inside the red caboose, a different reality was unfolding. The ice fog coated the exterior, encasing it in a shell of white. This ice, counterintuitively, acted as an extra layer of insulation, reducing wind-driven heat loss. The structure was so tightly sealed that there were no drafts. A single candle flame on the small table did not flicker. The fire-brick stove required a remarkably small amount of fuel. Václav would load it with a few split logs of seasoned oak in the morning and again at night. The dense bricks would soak up the heat and radiate it steadily for hours, a gentle, penetrating warmth that filled the entire space. The temperature inside never dropped below 55 degrees. Anichka went about her domestic routines in a state of quiet wonder. She could work in her shirt sleeves. The children, Jan and Zuzana, could play on the floor without being bundled in layers of wool. The difference was not just in comfort, but in life itself. One morning, Anichka decided to bake bread. She took out the small stoneware crock where she kept her sourdough starter. She mixed flour and water and set it on the shelf above the stove. A week before, during a cold snap before the fog, she had tried the same thing. The crock, left in the same spot, had frozen solid overnight, killing the yeast. The cold had penetrated even that close to the fire. Now she watched it, half expecting failure. She went about her morning chores. 2 hours later, she looked again. The yeast was alive. It was more than alive. It was thriving. A dome of bubbly, active starter had risen to double its volume, pressing against the cloth cover of the crock. In a world frozen solid, in a cabin where her neighbors were fighting for survival, life was fermenting on her shelf. It was a small domestic miracle, a proof more profound than any thermometer. Down on the line, Ferris Tolmachov was facing his own crisis. The extreme cold was hell on the rails. Steel contracted, becoming brittle. A hidden flaw in the metal could fracture, causing a derailment. It was his job to inspect every foot of his section, every day, no matter the weather. He and Miller were pumping their handcar down the track, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were 2 miles from the section house when it happened. A sharp crack, a lurch, and the handcar slewed sideways. One wheel shattered. There was no fixing it. They were stranded. The walk back would be brutal, dangerous in this cold. "Damnedest luck," Miller muttered, his words muffled by the scarf over his face. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," Tolmachov grunted, his face grim. "It's just the cold. Let's get moving. Don't stop." They began the long, trudging walk back along the tracks. Every breath was painful. The ice fog swirled around them, limiting visibility to 100 yards. Their bodies, which had been generating heat from the work of pumping, began to cool rapidly. Tolmachov knew the signs of frostbite, the creeping numbness in the fingers and toes, the waxy pallor of the skin on the nose and cheeks. They were in real trouble. As they rounded the long curve below the Doljal claim, the fog thinned for a moment. A weak, watery sun found a gap in the clouds, and Ferris Tolmakov saw something that made him stop dead in the middle of the tracks. He stared up the hill at the red caboose. Every other surface in the world was white. The trees, the grass, the fence posts, the roof of his own section house visible in the distance, all were covered in a thick, crystalline layer of frost. But the south-facing windows of Václav Dolijal's cupola were black and clear. Not just clear, they were wet. As he watched, a drop of water formed on the edge of a window pane, grew heavy, and fell. It was followed by another. Tiny rivulets of meltwater were running down the glass. Water, liquid water, running in the open air at 24 degrees below zero. It was impossible. It violated the fundamental laws of his experience. Water froze, metal froze, wood froze, glass frosted over. Yet up on that hill, a strange bohemian's foolish house was shedding water like it was a spring day. The sun was too weak to be doing it. The only explanation was that the heat was coming from inside. Not just heat, but an impossible amount of it. Enough to turn the exterior of the windows into a melting surface in the middle of a polar vortex. He didn't say a word to Miller. He just stored the image in his mind, a puzzle that his practical brain could not solve. He had predicted failure, leaks, a column of ice. He was witnessing the opposite, a structure so warm it was weeping water in the heart of the deep freeze. He never knocked on Václav's door that day. His pride wouldn't let him. But the image of that melting window haunted him. A week later, after the fog had broken, he found an excuse, a question about a stray calf, to walk up to the claim. Václav invited him in. The moment Tolmachov stepped through the door, the vindication was absolute and sensory. He had expected to walk from the cold into a slightly less cold, smoky room. Instead, he walked into a pocket of calm, steady, radiant warmth. There were no drafts. The air was clean. His face, numb from the wind, began to prickle as the blood returned. He took off his heavy gloves, then his coat. Anichka was rolling out dough on the table. The two children were sitting on the floor, playing with wooden blocks, wearing nothing but simple shirts and trousers. Václav offered him a cup of coffee. As Tolmachov took it, his eyes scanned the interior. He saw the tight seams, the ingenious stove, the dry floor. He saw the crock of yeast on the shelf, still active. He remembered his own predictions of a racked frame and gaping holes. There were none. The caboose was as tight as a drum. He walked over to the south wall and placed his bare palm flat against the interior wall beneath the cupola. He expected to feel the chill of the outside. Instead, the wood was warm to the touch. It was saturated with hours of stored sunlight. He stood there for a long moment, the warmth seeping into his hand. He was a practical man, a man who believed in what he could see and measure. And the evidence was overwhelming. He turned to Václav, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. All his confident mockery, all his professional certainty had been wrong. "You didn't build a house, Dolajal," he said, his voice low with a new kind of respect. "You built a goddamned lantern." News on the prairie traveled through social gatherings. The following June, the Dolajals attended a cousin's wedding in Tabor, the heart of the Czech settlement in the county. The story of the warm caboose had circulated as a piece of winter gossip, a strange tale of the eccentric newcomer. At the long tables of the reception hall, over plates of kulaks and roast pork, the questions began. 4 men, heads of families from neighboring claims who had struggled through the ice fog, approached Václav. They were skeptical, but after their own winter suffering, they were curious. The next Sunday, a wagon carrying the 4 families, the Petras, the Novaks, the Dvoraks, and the Kermaks, pulled up to the Dolezal claim. They spent the afternoon. The men inspected the stone piers, tapped on the sealed walls, examined the fire brick stove. Their wives spoke with Anichka, who explained with simple pride how she had baked bread while their own cabins were freezing, how the children had not been sick for a single day. They felt the lingering warmth in the walls, even on a warm summer day. They understood. It wasn't magic, it was just smart. That afternoon was the tipping point. The proof was no longer a story. It was a place they could stand in. By that autumn, 6 families, including the 4 who had visited, had made deals with the railroad. The boneyard in Yankton was slowly emptied of its derelict cars. That fall, the sight of a boxcar or a caboose being dragged across the prairie became less a spectacle of madness and more a sign of practical hope. They weren't all as meticulously executed as Václav's, but they all followed his core principles: Southern orientation, sealed envelopes, and thermal mass. A small community of Karsteaders was born, their strange, industrial-looking homes a testament to an idea that worked. Václav Dolezal's frontier innovation was a century ahead of its time. He had, with salvaged materials and the knowledge of his old-world trade, created a high-performance home that anticipated the core tenets of modern building science. The south-facing cupola was a direct-gain passive solar system. The tight sealed envelope was the very definition of modern air sealing standards that architects now use to prevent heat loss. The dense fire brick stove and dark floor functioned as a trombe wall in miniature, a thermal mass placed within the insulated envelope to absorb solar heat and release it slowly. He had built what we would now call a resilient and sustainable dwelling, not with advanced polymers and triple-pane windows, but with iron, wood, and a deep understanding of physics. He moved into a thing shaped to hold fire. A house is a box for living in. A caboose is something different. It is the final watchful eye of a long train. It is a shelter designed specifically for the brakeman, whose job was to manage the immense forces of fire and steam and motion. Its heart is the stove. Its purpose is to provide a small, tough haven of warmth and stability at the violent, chaotic end of a freight train. It is built to endure, to absorb shock, to shed the weather at 60 miles an hour. Václav Dolezal did not turn a caboose into a house. He simply recognized its essential nature and moved his family inside it. He sought shelter in a structure that was already designed to keep a man warm against the relentless cold of the outside world. It was not a house, but it was more than enough. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the Dakota Prairie. If you appreciated this story of how old-world knowledge and keen observation solved a life or death problem, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, what modern problem do you think could be solved with a bit of old-fashioned wisdom? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices of the era. Anyone attempting to apply these or similar techniques in a modern context should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.